The reading of Sir Hugh Ashworth's will took place in the long drawing room at Fenwick Hall, and Eleanor Ashworth sat by the window where the draught was worst, which was, she understood, exactly where the family wanted her. She was 38, and she had spent the last 6 years of her life nursing the old man through the slow ruin of his final illness, while her siblings sent flowers and went to Verbier. She had moved into Fenwick Hall when their father's hands began to shake too badly to hold a pen, and she had stayed through the long degradation of his decline. The feeding, the washing, the 3 in the morning terrors, the patient management of a proud man's humiliation at his own failing body. She had done it without complaint and largely without thanks, because she had loved him, and because someone had to, and because her brother Julian and her sister Cassandra had made it abundantly clear that the someone would not be them. The solicitor, a careful man named Mr. Aldous Pendley, cleared his throat and began to read, and the family arranged their faces into the expressions of grief they had been practicing all morning. It did not take long for those expressions to give way to something else. To my son, Julian Ashworth, I leave Fenwick Hall, the London property in Eaton Square, and my controlling shareholding in Ashworth Vintners. Julian, 42, and already running the family wine business in all but name, allowed himself a grave, dignified nod, as though the universe had merely confirmed an arrangement long understood. To my daughter, Cassandra Ashworth Vane, I leave the sum of £2,000,000, the contents of the Fenwick cellars, and my shares in the Geneva holdings. Cassandra dabbed at a dry eye. And so it continued, the great estate of Sir Hugh Ashworth, wine merchant, knight of the realm, builder of one of England's most respected family wine empires, carved with smooth precision between the 2 children who had given him the least. Eleanor listened to houses and millions and shares move into hands that had barely touched their fathers in years, and she kept her own hands folded in her lap, and she waited. And finally, said Mr. Pendley, and here he paused and looked over his spectacles toward the window, to my daughter, Eleanor Ashworth. The room turned. Julian's expression was already arranging itself into something between pity and satisfaction. To my daughter Eleanor, Pendley read. In recognition of, he hesitated, then read it plainly, I leave my personal effects of no commercial value and this. He reached into a leather case and withdrew a book. He set it on the table. It was a diary, an old one bound in cracked oxblood leather, the kind a man might keep for a single year. He slid it across to Eleanor. For a moment no one spoke. Then Julian reached over before Eleanor could touch it and flipped it open. He turned the pages, one after another, faster and faster. They were blank. Every page, empty, not a word, not a mark from cover to cover. Julian laughed a short, incredulous bark. It's empty. He left her an empty diary. He turned to the room, delighted. After all of it, 6 years playing nursemaid and angling for the estate, and father saw right through it. A blank book and his old slippers, my God. He looked at Eleanor and his pity was gone now, replaced by something colder and more honest. Well, there you are, Nell, that's what your devotion was worth to him. Nothing. Cassandra had the grace to look away. Eleanor said nothing. She reached across the table and picked up the diary. It was light in her hands, and the leather was soft with age, and when she opened the front cover she saw what Julian, in his haste to humiliate her, had not stopped to notice, that on the inside of the cover, in her father's hand, in the careful copperplate of a man who had not yet lost his grip on the pen, were 4 words. For the one who reads. Eleanor closed the diary, and she held it, and her face gave away nothing at all. Because Eleanor Ashworth knew something the rest of them did not. She knew that her father had never in his life done anything by accident. And she knew that the diary was not blank. To understand what Eleanor knew, you would have had to understand the thing the family had spent 20 years choosing to forget. That before she was the dutiful daughter, the spinster nurse, the one who stayed, Eleanor had been something else entirely. She had been the clever one. The one her father took to the great auctions when she was a girl, who could tell a genuine 18th century vintage from a clever fake by the color of the wax. She had read chemistry at Cambridge and then, to her father's quiet delight and her siblings' open contempt, had gone into a field none of them understood or respected. She had become a documents and materials analyst, a forensic specialist in the authentication of historic papers, inks, and manuscripts. For 11 years, before she came home to nurse her father, Eleanor had worked for auction houses, museums, and occasionally the police, examining disputed documents under spectroscopes and ultraviolet light, exposing forgeries, recovering text from pages that the human eye declared empty. She knew, better than almost anyone alive, that a blank page is very rarely blank. There is ink that fades to invisibility with time. There is ink that was never visible to begin with, sympathetic inks, the old word was, the invisible inks of secret correspondence, written in substances that vanish as they dry and return only under heat, or ultraviolet light, or the right chemical reagent. There are indentations, the ghost of writing pressed through from a page since removed. There is text written and then chemically erased, which leaves, to the trained instrument, a shadow that can be raised again. Her father had known what she did for a living. He had been, in fact, the only member of the family who had ever taken the least interest in it. He had sat with her, in the last good months before his mind began to go, and asked her about her work, about the recovery of lost text, about the cases she had cracked, about the famous forgery she had unmasked that had made the national papers. He had listened with an attention she had not understood at the time. She understood it now. For the one who reads, not the one who inherits, not the one who schemes. The one who reads, who could look at a page everyone else called empty, and know that emptiness was a kind of message in itself. Her father had left his secrets, whatever they were, in the one place only Eleanor in all the world was equipped to find them, and he had let the rest of them laugh, knowing they would laugh, knowing their laughter was the surest way to make certain they never looked twice at the thing they were handing away. That night in her small room at the top of Fenwick Hall, the servant's room more or less, that the family had let her keep until the house transferred to Julian, Eleanor Ashworth sat down at the desk, switched on the ultraviolet lamp she had kept from her working years, and held the first page of the diary beneath its glow. And the page which the entire family had pronounced blank began, faintly, in lines of ghostly blue-white to fill with her father's writing. She did not sleep that night. The ink her father had used was a sympathetic compound. She recognized it almost at once, an iron and acid formulation that dried clear and fluoresced under UV, an old technique, the sort of thing a man of his generation and his romantic streak might have known from boyhood books about spies. He had written the entire diary in invisible ink, page after page, in a hand that grew, she could see, steadily less steady as the months advanced and his illness deepened. He had been writing it, she realized, through the very period she had been nursing him, in the hours she left him to rest in the early mornings in secret. He had been leaving her a map. But it was not at first what she expected. She had imagined perhaps hidden bank accounts, a list of assets, some final fortune squirreled away to right the imbalance of the will. There was none of that. Instead, the first pages were something stranger, and she would come to understand, far more important. They were a confession. Eleanor, the first entry read, raised letter by letter under her lamp. If you are reading this, then you found what I hid in plain sight, and I was right about you, as I have been right about almost nothing else. I have a great deal to tell you, and not much time or strength to tell it, and I must write it where the others will never look. They will fight over the house and the shares and the cellars. Let them. What I am leaving you is worth more than all of it, and it is also a burden I am ashamed to hand to anyone. But you are the only one who can carry it, because you are the only one who was ever interested in the truth. Ashworth Vintners is not what the world believes it to be. Eleanor set down the lamp for a moment and pressed her fingers to her eyes. Then she picked it up again and read on. What her father confessed, across those ghostly pages, unspooled over the following nights as she worked through the diary entry by entry, raising his hidden words a page at a time. And it was this. The great and respected house of Ashworth Vintners, suppliers of fine wine to royalty, to embassies, to the cellars of the aristocracy, a name synonymous for a century with integrity, had for the past 15 years been quietly built on fraud. Not by her father, by her brother. Julian, her father wrote, had begun it small, the way these things always begin. A few cases of ordinary wine relabeled as something rarer. Then more. Then, as the appetite and the profits grew, an entire operation, the systematic counterfeiting of rare and historic vintages, the very wines on which the firm's prestige rested. Julian had built, behind the respectable face of Ashworth Vintners, a counterfeiting enterprise of extraordinary sophistication, sourcing cheap wine, aging and doctoring it, producing flawless forged labels and capsules and provenance documents, and selling the results into the rarefied world of fine wine investment and collection for sums that ran, by now, into many tens of millions. I discovered it 4 years ago, her father wrote, his hand visibly shaking in the raised script, by accident. A bottle came back, a buyer in New York, a chemist like you who had it tested. It was a fake and it had come from us, and when I followed the thread I found the whole loom. My own son. My own name, the name my grandfather built, turned into a machine for cheating trusting people of their money. I am a coward, Eleanor. I will admit it to you who I have wronged most, since I can admit it to no one else. I did not expose him. He is my son. The scandal would have destroyed the firm, the family, everything my forebears built. So I did nothing and I let it go on, and the shame of that has been eating me from the inside more surely than the illness. But I gathered the proof, every shred of it. I could not bring myself to use it, but I could not bear to destroy it either. So I have done the only thing my conscience and my cowardice could agree upon. I have hidden it, and I have left the key to it to you, the one person honest enough to do what I could not, and clever enough to find it. Eleanor sat very still in the cold little room at the top of the house, the lamp glowing over her father's confession, and outside the window the dawn was beginning to gray the Wiltshire hills. Downstairs, asleep in the grand bedrooms, her brother and sister dreamed of their inheritance, certain they had one, certain the empty book had been the final humiliation of the sister who didn't matter. They had handed her, laughing, the one thing in the world that could destroy them. The diary did more than confess. Across its later pages, her father had left precisely what an evidence-gatherer of Eleanor's training would have built herself, a guide to the proof. He had not kept the evidence in the diary. It was a map, not the treasure. But page by page he directed her to a safe deposit box in a private vault in Bristol, registered under the name of his late wife so that Julian would never think to look for it. The key taped. She found it exactly where he said, inside the spine of a particular ledger in the Fenwick Library. To the box's contents, the returned counterfeit bottle and its laboratory analysis, copies of forged provenance certificates with the genuine ones alongside them for comparison, financial records her father had quietly extracted showing the flow of money from the counterfeit sales through a lattice of offshore companies. And most damning of all, photographs her father had taken himself. In the last year he was still mobile, of the counterfeiting operation in a converted barn on a property Julian owned in the Loire. The doctored bottles, the label press, the aging apparatus, all of it. It was a complete case. Her father, who had lacked the courage to use it, had at least possessed the rigor to assemble it properly. He had been, Eleanor thought, with a complicated ache of love and grief, a coward and a craftsman both, right to the end. She drove to Bristol 3 days after the funeral and confirmed it all with her own eyes. And standing in the quiet of the vault with the evidence of her family's 2-decade fraud spread before her, Eleanor Ashworth made her decision. She would not be a coward as her father had been, but neither would she be a fool, because she understood something her father, in his isolation, perhaps had not fully reckoned with. The counterfeiting was not merely a family disgrace. It was an ongoing crime against thousands of people. Every collector who had paid a fortune for an Ashworth authenticated rarity, every investment fund that held forged bottles as assets, every auction house that had sold them in good faith, all of them had been defrauded, and the fraud was still running. Julian now in full control of the firm with their father safely dead, and the dutiful sister disinherited and gone. This was bigger than Fenwick Hall. It was bigger than the will. Eleanor was holding the thread that pulled would unravel one of the largest wine frauds in history, and the only thing standing between that fraud and justice was a woman everyone had agreed to consider worthless. She thought she would have time. She was wrong. Because Julian Ashworth had not built an empire of deception by being careless. And he had begun, in the days after the funeral, to wonder about the diary. It started with Cassandra, as these things in the family always did, with a phone call that pretended to be warmth. "Nell, darling, I've been worried about you rattling around on your own after everything. Julian and I were saying, we feel just awful about the will. Truly, father wasn't himself at the end. We'd like to put things right, make you a proper settlement from our own shares." A pause, sugared and careful. "That funny old diary he left you. Sentimental, isn't it? Julian wondered if you'd let him have it. You know how he is about father's things. We'd pay you handsomely for it, of course. Call it part of putting things right." Eleanor, who had been raised among these people and knew the precise sound of a trap being baited, said warmly that the diary was a sweet, sad keepsake, entirely blank, and that she was thinking of having it framed, and that she'd consider their kind offer about a settlement and let them know. She hung up and understood that the clock had started. They knew, or they feared. Julian had begun to remember, perhaps, that their father had spent his last good months talking to Eleanor about her work, about raising lost text from blank pages. He had begun to do the arithmetic of his own guilt, and the answer frightened him, and now he wanted the diary not as a keepsake but as a thing to be burned. The pressure escalated with a speed that told Eleanor exactly how frightened her brother was. The generous settlement offers grew larger and came with shorter deadlines. Then they curdled. A letter arrived from the family solicitors, not Mr. Pendley, who had quietly retired, but a sharp London firm now acting for Julian, asserting that certain personal papers left to Eleanor may contain confidential business information belonging to Ashworth Vintners, and demanding their return. It was a clever move, an attempt to reclaim the diary under cover of commercial confidentiality before Eleanor could be shown to have read it. And then, the night after that letter arrived, someone broke into the top room at Fenwick Hall. Eleanor was not there. She had moved out the week before into a rented cottage in the next county and had taken, of course, the diary and her lamp with her. But she heard from the housekeeper, the one old retainer who still had any loyalty to her, that her room had been searched in the night, the desk drawers forced, the floorboards lifted. Nothing taken because nothing was there. Eleanor sat in her rented cottage with the diary locked in a fireproof case and understood that her brother had moved past offers and lawyers. He was searching now, and a man who would counterfeit on that scale, who stood to lose tens of millions and his liberty besides, was a man who would not stop at searching empty rooms. She was afraid. She would not have been sane not to be. But underneath the fear was the steadiness that 11 years in the forensic trade had built in her, the discipline of a woman who had sat across interview tables from forgers and fraudsters, and learned that panic is the one luxury the person holding the truth cannot afford. If Julian wanted to make this a race, Eleanor thought, then she would simply have to be faster and cleverer and more thorough than a man who had spent his whole life assuming she was none of those things. She made copies. That was the first rule, the rule any document analyst knew in her bones. The evidence that exists in only one place is the evidence that can be destroyed. She photographed every raised page of the diary under UV, documented every item in the Bristol vault, and lodged complete encrypted copies in 3 separate secure locations, including with a solicitor of her own choosing, not the family's. A meticulous woman in Bath named Harriet Keel, who specialized in fraud and had no love for grand families who thought the law was a thing that happened to other people. And then Eleanor did the thing that her father had never been able to do. She took the truth to people who could act on it. She did not go straight to the police. Eleanor understood evidence and she understood the world, and she knew that a complex fraud worth tens of millions, with offshore structures and forged documents spanning 15 years, needed to land not on the desk of a local constable, but in the hands of people equipped to understand it. She went, with Harriet Keel beside her, to the Serious Fraud Office, and separately to the specialist team at the City of London Police that handled exactly this kind of high-value deception. They were, at first, cautious. A disinherited daughter bringing accusations against the brother who'd received the estate is a figure the law has learned to treat warily, since bitterness wears the mask of evidence so often. Eleanor had anticipated this. It was precisely why her father's meticulousness and her own mattered so much. She did not bring them a grievance. She brought them a forensic case. The analyzed counterfeit bottle, the side-by-side forged and genuine provenance documents, the financial trail, the photographs of the operation in the Loire, and the detail that made the investigators sit forward in their chairs, her own professional credentials as a documents analyst, and the chain of custody she had maintained on every piece of it with a rigor that would survive any courtroom. Mrs. M.S. Ashworth, the lead investigator, said slowly, turning over the photographs, "You understand what you're handing us." "I understand exactly what I'm handing you," Eleanor said. "I've spent 11 years authenticating documents and unmasking forgeries. I know what a complete evidential case looks like. This is one. My father assembled most of it. I have verified it." She paused. "He couldn't bring himself to use it because the man at the center of it is his son. I don't have that difficulty. The man at the center of it has been stealing from thousands of people for 15 years, and he is still doing it today, under a name that means honesty to everyone who trusts it. That has to stop." The investigation that followed was quiet and patient and thorough, and it ran for months beneath the surface of Julian Ashworth's confident life, while he believed he was still hunting a frightened sister for a sentimental book. But fraud of that scale is a living thing, with employees and partners and counterparties, and a quiet investigation can only stay quiet so long. Word reached Julian eventually that questions were being asked, by the kind of people who did not ask questions idly. And he understood at last that the diary had not been blank, and that his disinherited sister had not been the negligible thing he had spent his whole life assuming, and that the structure he had built was beginning, somewhere beneath him, to crack. He did the thing that cornered men of his type always do. He tried to get ahead of the truth by destroying the person carrying it. The campaign against Eleanor was launched with the polish of a man who had spent his life managing reputations. A story appeared, first in a trade publication and then in a national paper's gossip pages, that the disinherited daughter of the late Sir Hugh Ashworth, embittered by her exclusion from the family estate, was waging a campaign of malicious and baseless accusations against her brother, the respected head of Ashworth Vintners. Unnamed sources described Eleanor as unstable, consumed by resentment, a woman who had given up her career to live off her father and been justly passed over. The piece noted, with surgical cruelty, that she had no current employment and had been living alone in rented accommodation since the funeral, painting the portrait the family needed. A bitter, failed, solitary woman inventing crimes to punish the relatives who had seen through her. It was, Eleanor recognized, the same weapon her brother used on his customers, a forgery. A counterfeit Eleanor, aged and doctored and labeled to look like truth, sold to a public that couldn't tell the difference. The family closed ranks behind the story, Cassandra gave a tearful interview about how the whole family was heartbroken by Eleanor's decline. Even some of the old friends of the house, who had eaten at Sir Hugh's table for decades, shook their heads and said it was a great sadness, what bitterness could do to a person. Julian, advised by his lawyers, made his masterstroke. He applied to the court for an injunction to compel the return of the diary and all copies of its contents, on the grounds that it contained confidential and commercially sensitive information belonging to Ashworth Vintners, that Eleanor was threatening to disseminate maliciously. If it succeeded, it would be a thing of beautiful cynicism, a court order requiring Eleanor to hand over the very evidence of his crimes, and to destroy her copies of it, all dressed in the language of protecting a business from a vengeful relative. The hearing was set, and Julian, confident, well-lawyered, and certain that the weight of the family name and the portrait of the unstable sister would carry the day, made sure it would be a public one, reported, attended, a stage on which the troublesome Eleanor would at last be silenced and shamed before everyone who mattered. He had once again made the mistake that ran in the family like a fault in the rock. He had built a public showdown and invited the press to it, and assumed that the woman standing opposite him was the worthless thing he had always needed her to be. He had built the perfect room in which to be destroyed. The application was heard in open court before a judge in chambers that the press had been encouraged, by Julian's own people, to attend. Julian arrived with his London silk and his sister and a row of supporters, immaculate, grave, the wronged head of a great house seeking only to protect it from a bitter woman's malice. Eleanor arrived with Harriet Keel, and a barrister of Harriet's choosing and a slim case file, and no supporters at all, and she sat quietly while Julian's counsel laid out the portrait the family had been painting for months. The embittered daughter, the confidential papers, the campaign of baseless accusation, the need for the court's protection. And then it was Eleanor's turn, and her barrister rose, and what followed was not a defense. It was a detonation. "My client," the barrister began, "is content for the court to examine the diary at the center of this application. Indeed, she invites it. Because my learned friend has described it repeatedly as containing confidential business information, the court will wish to know how he knows what it contains, given that his own case is that it was left to my client, that he has never lawfully possessed it, and that, to every other member of the family who has examined it, it appears to be entirely blank." A stillness entered the room. "It appears blank," the barrister continued, "because it is written in sympathetic ink, an ink invisible to the naked eye, legible only under ultraviolet light or chemical reagent. The late Sir Hugh Ashworth wrote it so. He left it to his daughter Eleanor for one reason, that she is, by profession, a forensic documents analyst with 11 years' experience recovering invisible and erased text, a fact my learned friend's clients found so embarrassing they have spent 3 months telling the newspapers she has no career at all." Eleanor watched her brother's face, and she saw the exact moment the floor opened beneath him. "The applicant says the diary contains confidential information belonging to Ashworth Vintners," the barrister said. "He is right. It contains a detailed account, written in his own father's hand, of a 15-year conspiracy to counterfeit rare wines and defraud collectors and investors of, by Sir Hugh's own estimate, more than £60 million. It directs the reader to a vault containing the proof. My client has read that diary, because she is the one person able to. She has verified its contents, and she has, for the past 4 months, been working with the Serious Fraud Office and the City of London Police, to whom the entirety of this evidence was provided under formal chain of custody before these proceedings ever began." The barrister set down a single sheet. "This application is not an attempt to protect a business from a bitter relative. It is an attempt to compel a court of law to order the destruction of evidence of a serious crime, and to silence the only honest witness to it. We would respectfully invite the court to consider why a man would go to such lengths to recover a book he insists is blank. There was, in the courtroom, the particular silence of a great many people, understanding a great many things at once. And it was into that silence that the doors at the back opened, and two officers of the City of London Police entered, not by chance. Harriet Keel's timing had been exact, and the lead investigator made his way to the front, and the judge, looking up, was informed that the gentleman was there in connection with an active fraud investigation, and that the matter before the court might wish to be adjourned in light of it. Julian Ashworth rose halfway from his seat, his silks restraining hand on his arm, his mouth open on a denial that would not come, and found that there was no longer anyone in the room who believed him. The collapse, once it began, was total, in the way that frauds collapse when the single thread is finally pulled, and the whole woven thing comes apart at once. The serious fraud office, no longer constrained by the need for quiet, moved within the week. The barn in the Loire was raided. The label press and the aging apparatus and a warehouse of doctored bottles were exactly where Sir Hugh's photographs had said they would be. The offshore structure was unpicked. Julian Ashworth was charged with conspiracy to defraud, forgery, and money laundering on a scale that made the front pages he had so recently tried to fill with stories of his sister's madness. The case became, as Eleanor had foreseen, one of the largest wine fraud prosecutions in British history. Cassandra, who had given the tearful interviews, who had made the sugared phone calls, who had searched her sister's room in the night, was found to have known. The financial trail ran through accounts she had signed for, and faced charges of her own. The injunction application was not merely dismissed. The judge referred the conduct of it to the relevant authorities, observing in remarks that were widely reported that he had rarely seen the process of the court so cynically deployed. The newspapers that had printed the portrait of the unstable, bitter, failed sister printed, in the following weeks, a very different one. Eleanor declined most of the interviews. The one profile she did permit was scrupulous and quiet, and it told the truth. The forensic analyst who had given up her career to nurse her dying father, who had been disinherited and mocked with a blank book, and who had turned out to be the one person her father trusted with the truth, because she was the one person honest enough to carry it and clever enough to read it. For the one who reads, the headline ran, and Eleanor thought her father would have liked that. The collectors and investors who had been defrauded had a path to restitution now. The assets of the empire that Julian had built on lies were frozen and marshaled toward the people he had stolen from. Ashworth Vintners as a name did not survive, and Eleanor felt no grief at that. A name that means honesty is worth nothing once it has been used to sell lies, and better, she thought, that it end than that it go on as a lie about itself. There remained the will, and here in the end the law did something quietly fitting, because a man cannot inherit the proceeds of his own fraud, and a great part of Sir Hugh's estate, the shares, the value of the firm, had been bound up in the counterfeiting enterprise. The entire settlement was reopened and unwound. Fenwick Hall, the houses, the millions, the structure of the will collapsed alongside the structure of the crime. When it was all reassembled by the courts and the administrators, the estate that remained, the genuine, clean, lawful part of it, passed in large measure to the one heir who had been convicted of nothing, deceived no one, and been left, by a dying man who knew exactly what he was doing, the only thing that mattered, the truth, and the means to read it. Eleanor inherited Fenwick Hall. She had not sought it, and she was a long time deciding what to do with the great cold house where she had nursed her father and been made to sit in the draft. In the end she did not sell it, and she did not live in it as her family had, as a monument to a name. She gave the bulk of it over to a foundation for the forensic study and authentication of historic documents and artifacts, a working institute, the first of its kind in the country, where the science she had spent her life on would train others to do what she had done, to look at the pages the world calls blank, and to refuse to believe them. She kept only the top room for herself, the small cold servant's room where she had first held the lamp to her father's hidden words. She had a good window put in, and a proper desk, and there, sometimes in the evenings, she worked, raising lost text from old paper for museums and courts and families who had been told that nothing was there. Her brother wrote to her once from prison, a long letter, half apology and half the old contempt, asking in the end for her help with his appeal. Eleanor read it carefully, the way she read everything, and she did not answer it with anger, because she had learned from her father that cowardice and cruelty are nearer cousins than people think, and she wanted no part of either. She simply did not answer it at all. There are letters that deserve a reply, and there are letters whose writing was only ever another attempt to use you, and Eleanor had spent 11 years learning to tell a genuine document from a forgery. Cassandra she saw once, after it was all over, across a room at the necessary settling of the estate. Her sister had aged and the sugar was gone from her, and she looked at Eleanor with something that might, in a smaller person, have grown one day into understanding. "We never saw you," Cassandra said quietly. "Not once, all those years. We looked right at you and we saw nothing." "I know," Eleanor said. "It was not forgiveness and it was not cruelty. It was only the truth, which was the thing Eleanor had given her life to. That was always the mistake, not the will. The not seeing came first. The will was just where it finally showed." On a clear evening a year after the reading of the will, Eleanor sat at her desk in the top room of Fenwick Hall, the ultraviolet lamp dark beside her, her father's diary, its hidden pages now fully raised, transcribed, and preserved, closed under her hand. She thought about how they had all laughed, Julian flipping the blank pages, delighted, certain the empty book was the final proof that her devotion had been worth nothing. The whole family watching the worthless sister receive her worthless inheritance, none of them, not one, pausing to wonder why a man as deliberate as Sir Hugh Ashworth would leave his most careful child an empty book. The answer had been there all along, 4 words inside the cover, written for the only person who would think to read them, for the one who reads. They had seen a blank page and called it nothing, but a blank page, Eleanor had known her whole life, is almost never nothing. It is more often a message written for someone with the patience and the skill and the care to bring it into the light, a test of who is willing to look harder than the surface invites. Her father had spent his life surrounded by people who only ever read the surface, the value on the label, the name on the house, the size of the bequest, and he had left the truth at the last to the one child who had never been satisfied with surfaces. The people who dismiss you, Eleanor thought, are telling you something true, but it is about them, not about you. They are telling you the exact limit of how hard they are willing to look, and what lies past that limit, your worth, your truth, the whole hidden text of who you are, remains there whether they read it or not, real and waiting, legible to anyone who cares enough to bring the right light. She had been called blank her whole life by people too lazy or too frightened to read her. She had turned out to be the most important page in the book. Eleanor switched off the desk lamp and sat for a while in the blue dusk over the Wiltshire hills, at peace in the small room at the top of the great house, a woman who had always been worth reading, and who had simply waited, with the patience her work had taught her, for the truth to come into the light where no one could pretend it wasn't there.